Great. So I did this presentation last week, and there are 17 global goals, as most of you probably already know, and we didn't make it through all of them because obviously we only have half an hour. So I saved half of them for today. So I know a lot of you weren't in this particular talk last week or 2 weeks ago. So what I'm going to do is quickly do an overview of what the Sustainable Development Goals are and what exactly we're doing here today. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals run from 2015 to 2030. They're sort of the ascendants of or descendants of the UN Millennium Development Goals, which went from 2000 to 2015. So it's important to look at these dates because right now we're 5 years in and we still have 10 years left. So it's a good time for us to take pause, look at the goals, see which ones are doing well, see which ones aren't doing well, and maybe make some changes and backtrack a little bit or work on things that are working. So what are the goals? They are a collection of 17 global goals designed to be a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable world for all, or future for all. They were set in 2015, like I said, by the United Nations General Assembly, voted on by all the members, obviously passed, and intend to be achieved by 2030. It's obviously a huge project, probably the biggest one the world has ever done. So it's very ambitious, it's very lofty. That's sort of one of the biggest criticisms of it. But how are we going to get anywhere if we don't aim high, right? So I think for me, someone who's usually ambitious and optimistic, it's good to aim really high so you can actually actually get somewhere. And actually there's a Pitbull lyric, the rapper, which I really like. Probably not the most familiar context with this, but you should always reach for the moon. So even if you fall, you land in the stars. So we actually use this particular lyric when we were telling young people about the goals and how important it is to be really ambitious. These are all the goals together. As you can see, they range from all kinds of issues. So the first one is no poverty, which obviously is at the epicenter and the base of a lot of global problems. We go into hunger and health and education and gender equality, water, and all the way down into life below water, life on land, peace and justice, and partnerships. So there's a lot of different goals here. There's a lot of different countries in the world. So you can think about what countries were advocating for what and what countries were probably advocating against what goal. So imagine all the world's countries sitting together on a table having to agree on something. It's a pretty bold undertaking. So it's important to see that a lot of different voices had to be represented here. There's definitely some goals here where I'm like, do they belong here? Do they not? But then again, it's not a personal thing, it's a global thing. So it's important to put those glasses on when you're looking at these. It's also good to pick one or two goals as goals you want to focus on yourself in your business or personally. The UN Sustainable Development Goals website has really good resources on how you can work towards them. So instead of trying to do it all and doing everything, it's good to maybe focus on something that speaks to you personally. For me, it's number 5, gender equality, but whatever works for you, whatever works for your business is usually a good way to go. I wanted to pull this slide up just because it's important for us to see how the UN communicates goals. One of my main responsibilities was to make sure that companies and general public understand how they can work on the goals. If I tell you we should eliminate hunger, that really doesn't affect you personally. If it doesn't, if you're not affected by hunger, you don't really know what you can do about that. So in an effort for that, we made actionable actions for folks to do things in their own communities. If you look at the hunger goal number 2, it says waste less food and support local farmers. Most of us, if not all of us, can do that. And by doing that in our own communities, you're making a dent on global hunger. So just having actionable communication for your audience is extremely important, because if you tell someone we should all eliminate poverty together, but not tell them how they can do that personally, that's not really going to get you anywhere, will it? Like I said, we're going to start on goal number 9, as I did the first half last time. We made these graphics just to explain where we are in terms of data and subsets of the goals. Each goal obviously has subsets. If I tell you we're trying to end poverty, it's not just one particular issue, it's a lot of issues that go under poverty. So it's important to understand that every goal has various different categories under it. So at goal number 9, it's build resilient infrastructure, promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Super heavy, a lot of words there. A lot of people don't even understand what that means. But the biggest thing to look at here is to bring technology to more countries in an effort to obviously reduce poverty and improve societies economically. Where are we on that? Couple of statistics. Global investment research and development is $2 trillion, up from $739 billion. So a huge increase there. It's important to also look where those investments are being made, and most of them are being made in the industrialized West, which brings us to industrialization in lesser developed countries is too slow to meet the target. So we're not really on target with this particular goal, largely because there's a difference in the geographic investment that we're looking at. So it's important to see where investments being made and who's actually benefiting from these investments. At the bottom, you can see medium, high, and high tech sectors. 45%, they're 45% of the global manufacturing value add, but it's only 15% in sub-Saharan Africa. So what that pretty much means is global manufacturing technology sectors are giving 45% in general on average to countries, but if you're in a sub-Saharan African country, that's reduced to 15%. So again, you see that geographical mismatch there, which again then contributes to a lesser economic development in regions like sub-Saharan Africa. Number 10, again, a goal that's a little bit vague when you look at it, but you look at the sub goals, it makes sense. Reduce inequality within and among countries. One of the big things that the UN was focusing on was making sure that countries were a little more equitable, and then within countries, people's lives were a little more equal. Inequality remains a huge problem, definitely in the United States, also in countries around the world, and also within countries. If you look at countries in Western Europe compared to countries in other parts of the world, or even countries in Northern Africa compared to Sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of difference, which has caused for a lot of problems. A couple of numbers there, which are interesting, which we pulled out, was in more than half countries that were surveyed, so around 92 countries, the income of the bottom 40% of the population is actually growing faster than the national average. So that's a very promising data metric for this particular goal, which is telling us that inequality is being reduced because the lower sort of income classes are rising faster than the middle and top classes. So it's good news, especially for those of us who are used to hearing that the 1% is sort of getting everything and everyone else is left behind. So globally, it's a positive metric to look at. The other thing, if folks are more interested in, migration is something the UN is really focused on. At the bottom, where we can see data on rights around migration around the world. We have rural poor moving into urban cities for obviously better economic prospects, but a lot of them are not protected, and a lot of them are compromised or end up in jobs where they're really not making anything and are used. So it's important to see that the UN is also focusing on rights for migrants. So one of the sort of positive data points we can see is that 76% of the 105 countries that were surveyed do have policies on safe, orderly, and regular migration. 54% protect migrants' rights, and 57% have policies on their socioeconomic well-being, which means there's a safety net and there's resources available for them if they need them. So should be at 100, but 57, 54, sometimes are numbers we look at as positive numbers. Number 11, extremely important goal. So in the last 20 years, cities have been the focus of a lot of international development communication. Why? Because more and more people are moving to cities and more people live in cities. Cities have sort of become their own sort of governmental structure as well. I live in New York City, 9 million people in America's biggest city. And a lot of times you're seeing cities become more independent and become their own sort of entity. Really apparent right now during COVID. One of the big problems with this particular goal is that cities aren't doing as well as we'd like them to. A couple of the sub-goals under making cities more inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable is around trash collection and obviously hygiene and sanitation. 2 billion people still don't have access to waste collection services. So just think about that. If your waste keeps collecting either in your house or outside and no one takes it. It's a stark reality, and I'm sure a lot of us have seen it, but a lot of us don't really have to deal with it. And then think about the health conditions that result as a result of all the waste collected in your house or your communities. 1 out of 4 urban residents live in slum-like conditions. The UN details what slum-like conditions actually means. There's some parameters you have to fall and reach. And then 53% of urban residents have convenient access to public transport. So this is really important because a lot of cities will have poorer people living far outside the city and have to commute into the city to find work every day. So if you don't have convenient access to public transport, that there's a myriad of issues that will affect you, especially around safety, exhaustion, and also lesser money made during the day if you're actually taking 2 hours coming back and forth. Huge safety concerns also for females as they're coming into the city to work. So there's a lot of things that go along with transport as well. So within cities, the UN has also made sure that transport is prioritized and is accessible and is also reachable for people. 9 out of 10 urban residents breathe polluted air. Again, not a great metric. This was supposed to be down to 50%. It's still sitting at 90%. That's obviously a huge issue, and pollution is something that everyone has to do something about together, and countries can't really work on it by themselves to a less extent. Let's do a time check. Move through these quickly. So number 12, ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. A lot of us are familiar with sustainability. Our global material footprint is rapidly growing and it's outpacing population economic growth. No surprise here, very ambitious goal, but the world is trying to be a little more sustainable, but just not at the pace that we need to be. One good point that we can look at here is 100 countries are actively adopting new policies and measures to promote sustainable consumption and production. So out of 140 some countries, not a bad number, but again, the pace needs to be quicker and higher. Developed countries are using 20% of the natural resources to produce the same amount of economic output as developing countries. Important stat to look at as well. Developed countries, industrialized countries can actually use less resources to make the same product, while developing countries are using 5 times that resource. So the technology exchange is extremely important. So the developing countries can also use less natural resources. Climate change, obviously extremely important. Something that a lot of us have focused on, a lot of us talk about, especially young people. 186 parties have ratified the Paris Agreement. I think it's 185 now because our President Donald Trump pulled out of it. Hopefully that changes in November. The number we always look at for climate change is where the global mean temperature is. And currently it's 1 centigrade above the pre-industrial baseline from sort of 100 years ago. And that's a huge increase compared to where we should be right now. 1.3 million lives are claimed every year by climate-related disasters. That's another number the UN looks at. Unfortunate number, but it's important to see how climate change is actually affecting people's lives and taking people's lives. And then investment in fossil fuels. The UN tracks how much money is actually being spent on fossil fuels versus clean alternatives to see how climate change will be tackled and solved. Life below water. It's important to look at water as well. A lot of times we focus so much on land and sort of our life that we forget that we're surrounded by 72% ocean. One of the ways the UN measures this goal, which is conserve and sustainably use the oceans, sea, and marine resources for sustainable development, is looking at ocean acidity. It's increased 26% in the last century or so, and it's expected to rapidly increase by almost 150% in the next 80 years. So even you can compare those two numbers and see how much, how large it is, how disparate it is. It affects everything in the ocean, obviously fish and coral reefs, but in general, the whole globe is affected. So a couple of numbers here, which you can look at. One I think is really important is fish stocks. They've declined from 90% living in sustainable levels to 67% in 2015. And now the number is 54% only 5 years later. So it's really important for us to look at these numbers and see where we are, because we can see clean oceans, we can say the word, but it's when you look at actually the data behind it, painting a little bit of a bleak picture. Life on land, focusing on sustainable use of forests, ecosystems, combating desertification, and then halting land degradation and biodiversity loss. So again, a lot going on here, a lot of focus on wildlife, a lot of focus on forests. This is on the red list index, which means this goal is really not doing well at all 5 years in. Biodiversity loss is happening at a very accelerated rate, and the risk of species extinction is worsened by almost 10%. And the red list index basically tracks data on species of plants, corals, mammals, and birds to see how many of them we're losing year to year, which again is a pretty stark and depressing statistic. Land degradation is extremely important to look at as well. It doesn't get a lot of press and coverage, but a lot of people are obviously working on it. It's affecting 20% of the world's population, so around, 1/5 of the Earth's land area and 1 billion people. So land degradation pretty much means that crops can't grow. And you can imagine what would happen to agricultural economies if there's no crops growing. Another way to look at this, 116 countries have ratified the Nagoya Protocol, which addresses access to genetic resources and their fair use. How is that important? It helps people grow better crops, easier, sometimes faster. But there's obviously a lot around, there's a lot of controversy around GMO products as well. So a lot of these things, I guess the point here is, are complicated. We have to sort of look at the numbers and the ROI of what you're investing in. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. Again, a goal that sounds like a sort of very lofty dream, but again, you have to sort of dream big to get somewhere, right? So promoting peaceful, inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Why are we doing this? Men make up around 80% of homicide victims overall. So really, really depressing statistic, but a very important one. So 8 out of 10 people that are killed every year are male. However, women constitute 64% of homicide victims of intimate partner or family-related homicide. So whenever there's a crime committed inside the home or by a family member, 65 to 70% of the time, it's going to be a female. So that's a very important statistic for us to look at, because it shouldn't be the case, right? I mean, there's a huge gender disparity here, and family violence is a huge problem. So this goal tackles issues like this, where women and underrepresented communities and minorities can actually have access to justice. Someone asked for the presentation. I will shoot the link in here in 2 minutes, right before we're done. And then there's research and links at the end where you can access a lot of this information and a lot of the numbers. And then also put my email's also in it. So if you have any follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer them via email. Quickly moving forward. Partnerships, last goal, very important. A lot of us work in partnerships. If we're not, we should. I think replication of resources and duplication of resources is extremely amazing. That's why the UN exists. Strengthening the means of implementation and revitalizing global partnership for sustainable development. We basically, the reason for this goal is people to share information, to share data, to share metrics, and the UN sits in the middle of that. So there's a lot happening around this particular goal. A lot of folks are exclusively working on this goal to bring groups together, bring communities together. There's a lot of measurements here as well. So if you look at the one on top right, remittances, which is when people go abroad and make money and send it back to their families, are now the largest source of external financing in low and middle income countries. It's going to reach $550 billion, or it did reach that last year. So some huge important changes happening here, where folks are really kind of changing the way global development is done. More resources. There are a couple of organizations that work exclusively on measurement and dissemination of the goals and the metrics. You can look at UN Global Compact, the SDG Compass is doing great work as well. And then, like I mentioned before, SDG Media Zone has some great marketing materials and information that you all can use, especially if you're doing a business or consumer client focused merchandising. And then un.org/sustainable development is great as well, mainly because this is sort of their bread and butter and this is what they're focused on. I will put this link in our chat, and if anyone has any questions, we only have 1 minute, so you can shout it out. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining. It was great to meet everyone. I hope this was helpful.
These people are all around the world.
Here is the presentation link. My email's at the end. Any questions, let me know. And thank you so much for joining. There's a lot of good options.